Well, happy Friday, everyone. It's great to be back with you all as we take a closer look at some of the tools and methodologies that you can start using today to help prevent allergen-related recalls. I know this is a hot topic, and I am absolutely thrilled to have a top expert here to help guide us along. But before we head into the presentation, for all of the new folks joining FISMA Friday today, we're glad you're here. We've been doing this for about 10 years, a little over 10 years, and we've hosted this as a monthly webinar specifically designed for food and beverage manufacturers, processors, and distributors in order to get regular updates, insights, and guidance around the changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, as always, this series is brought to you by Safety Chain and the Acheson Group, where you not only will get the latest info, tips, and guidance around FSMA requirements, but you also have a chance to get your questions answered by the experts from TAG. So that all being said, just a quick note to let you know that all attendee mics have been muted, but you can submit your questions and comments at any time during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through them all. But if we happen to run out of time today, do not worry. We'll absolutely follow up with you after the session. And yes, of course, we are recording this presentation, so you can expect to get that recording and today's slides later today. So keep a look in your inbox for that. All right, now that that's out of the way, let's meet today's presenter, Dr. Steve Gendel. Now, as you can see from his experience, he is well-versed in today's topic, having been the very first FDA food allergen coordinator, contributing to many of the documents found within the FDA rules and guidance, including the gluten-free labeling rules. So Steve, we are honored to have you with us today. Welcome to FSMA Friday.
Well, thank you very much. I am pleased to be here. And let's start right off with the regulatory updates part of the talk. And what I wanted to mention today was the fact that the FDA reorganization that has been in the planning process for at least a year now looks like it's finally been approved and it is going to go forward. The FDA has announced in the Federal Register notice that they will be implementing it on October 1st this year. The October 1st, in case you don't recognize it, was chosen because that's the start of the next fiscal year. So everything, including budgets, all reset on October 1st, and that's a good time to start with a new organization. On the other hand, it'd be interesting to wait and see what happens this year with the annual question about, are we going to have a budget on October 1st with the new fiscal year? And I wonder what happens when you reorganize if the agency is on furlough because of a lack of a budget. But it will be real and it is coming, so look out for that. It will have an impact on many things, but you won't see it in the day-to-day operations, at least not for a while. The things that happen at the actual working levels of the agency will pretty much stay the same, and the changes will become something you see gradually. So getting into the allergen world, talking about allergen recalls, if you've been in the food industry for any more than just a little while, you've heard about all the problems with recalls. And one illustration about how bad the problem really is comes from this warning that I got in a search of the FDA database. So this is something from the FDA's own system where I did a search for food allergen recalls recently. Actually, I think it was last week. And the number of records that are recovered for food allergen related recalls is so big that even the FDA's own access system and information distribution system can't handle it. So that sort of puts a real exclamation point on the whole thing, that it's so big that even the agency in charge has trouble handling all the information. And of course, everybody is familiar with the fact that you see recalls related to allergens on at least a couple times a week. You can see these, and the same problem holds true with USDA regulated products and in other countries. The other thing that you have probably heard about, of course, is that these recalls cost a lot of money. And the best way to characterize the cost of these recalls is just to simply say it's a lot more than you can afford. No business is in a position to have to cope with all the costs that go with a recall. But it's important to think about those costs as having several different components. So one of them, of course, is the direct costs of a recall. Those are the things, the money that you have to spend to actually execute the recall. So that's the cost of pulling the products off the shelf. That's the cost of the products themselves that aren't being sold. That's the cost of the disposal of the products. That's the cost in terms of the time needed for the individuals who have to oversee the recall, the distribution people who have to actually execute the recall. A lot of time and money is taken up in those. The other thing is what you might call indirect costs. So those are things that come from not directly having to recall the product, but they come from things like the lost sales when you have to shut down a production facility and do a major reclean and testing. Those come from the fact that your resources get used up unexpectedly or your supply chains get disrupted because you are not producing according to the schedule that you wanted to have. But there's some other interesting ones that people don't think about. And those are things like, for instance, if you have recall insurance, the cost of your recall insurance is likely to be affected. And some of your other management costs are likely to be affected that aren't necessarily directed at a single recall. So, but they can have a big impact. And of course, if you're a publicly traded company, you're likely to see things like your stock price fall, which is not a food safety issue, but it certainly is a cost that people need to consider. And then finally, there are some non-monetary impacts, which in the long run are probably more important than the actual monetary ones. So anytime you have a recall, your brand, your company is going to suffer a hit to its reputation. You are going to lose consumers. You are going to lose trust at the retail end of the industry. You may find yourself being squeezed out of having shelf space at the grocery stores. You may find that people are less likely to want to have your products compared to your competitors. So the impacts can be big and they can last for quite a while. And of course, one of the other pieces that people have to be concerned about are the regulatory risks. And I wanted to remind you that the Preventive Controls for Human Foods rule in 21 CFR 117 requires that as a manufacturer, you protect against allergen cross contact in your production system. Pretty straightforward about that. So it also, of course, has, there are labeling requirements in there also, but in order to protect against allergen cross contact, you need to ensure protection from cross contact, including during storage, handling, and use of all your ingredients and your final products. So everything which you have coming in needs to be stored properly. Everything as you use it needs to be handled properly, and the equipment needs to be handled and taken care of properly. And also, you need to ensure that labeling of the finished foods is correct, including that it's not misbranded. And misbranding would be when you don't have proper allergen labeling. So the basic principle in allergen labeling is that all of your labels should be complete and accurate and non-misleading. So they should list all of the ingredients that you have in the product. They should be according to the correct formats and usages and should abide by the regulations in the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. We'll get back to issues about labeling and misbranding a little bit later and talk about that. But again, I did want to emphasize the importance of meeting your regulatory requirements, because if you have a recall that's associated with not having met those requirements, then you are going to be visited by the FDA. You are going to be getting probably a 483 after an inspection, and you could wind up with a warning letter or other regulatory actions. And this is something which is disappointingly common for the FDA to go to a facility and find that they have failed to either create an appropriate food safety plan that considers the allergens appropriately, or just as bad, that they've created a plan but not executed on it. So there is that regulatory risk. And that will wind up as an extra cost, of course, because then you will need to have a lot of lawyers involved and other expenses of dealing with that. So you're going to want to figure out how you can avoid getting allergen recalls or having to have an allergen recall. And to do that, you need to apply what I think of as the 3 pillars of effective allergen management. Those 3 pillars are knowing what you make, watching what you say, and controlling what you do. And it's actually very straightforward to think about those 3 pillars as being the way to organize your allergen management system. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to get into a lot of technical detail on these, but I did want to go over in a broad sense what each of these means. So let's talk about, one other point that I need to make here is that the first 2 relate to knowing what you make and what you say. It relate to the intended allergens. Those are the controls, the things that you need to do for the allergens that you use in your products because you intend to have them there. The controlling what you do applies to both the intended allergens and unintended allergens. So unintended allergens are the things that are present through cross contact. Those are things which are not actually ingredients in your product, not intended ingredients, and that can be present, and you need to control for those as well as with the intended allergens. So let's look at each of these 3 pillars in a little bit more detail, starting with knowing what you make. And really what that comes down to is making sure that you are aware of your formulas and recipes. So the questions you need to ask yourself in relation to this pillar is, has anything changed? Have you reformulated your product? Have you substituted ingredients? Have you made improvements? If any of those things have happened, you need to go back and look very carefully at whether any of those changes affect the allergen content of your product. If you have modified your inputs in any way. The second thing that you need to think about is when you're developing products, as well as when you are changing or improving your products, don't add new allergens if that can possibly be avoided. If you are already set up to handle a certain set of allergens in your facility, adding a new one creates lots of complications in production. It could mean scheduling changes. It could mean problems with storage. It could mean increased need for controls for cross contact. It can mean the need for additional training of your people. It can mean needing more cleaning and allergen testing processes. So it all gets things more complicated every time you add a new allergen. And it isn't just a small change. Even adding one new allergen can be a big change. So if it can be avoided, do it. The flip side of that people don't often think about is if you are reformulating or developing a product and you have some options about what ingredients to use and you can avoid adding allergens, that's also a good thing to think about. Then you need to be able to control your ingredient use during production. This basically means that when the processes are going on, product is being made, it's important to have good controls to make sure that the products that you make are made according to the recipes of the formulas that you have developed. People put the right ingredient in the right product. And that is something which seems like it could be pretty easy, but it sometimes gets harder than you might think, especially if you're making products that involve adding lots of white powders or off-white powders to a product. For people who are not paying close attention, it's easy to make a mistake about which ingredient is going in. So controlling during production to make sure that what you're making is being made according to the intended formula and recipes is an important part of this pillar of knowing what you make. The next pillar is watch what you say. In other words, watch what you say about your product. And there are two pieces to this one. One is the design of the labels of your product. Are your labels properly designed? Do they have all the required information? Are they formatted in the correct way? The other piece of this are the controls on your labels. So as you receive your labels and as you use your labels, you need to make sure that you have good controls on those. So that means checking, is the current label design accurate and complete? This is, again, something which people don't think about as much as they should. I've encountered situations where people are using label designs and statements that have been in place for decades, and they haven't realized that perhaps a supplier has changed the formula and ingredient, and they are receiving something with an intended allergen that they didn't even realize, so their labels are not accurate. If you use outside printing, check what you're getting from that. So that could be films, it could be labels that you apply, it could be cases or boxes that you put your product in. You need to make sure every single time that what you're getting is correct. And especially in large production runs, you need to make sure that if you start out correct, that you continue correct and that you finish correct. So if you need to change out where you're, perhaps which case of boxes you're using, make sure that the replacement is the correct one. If you have a very long film roll that you're using, make sure that the printer didn't splice something incorrectly in the middle, that you're actually getting the correct label all the way through the run. Those kinds of errors have happened and they will cause a big problem with the product. Similarly, if you do printing in-house, if the label or material or ingredient list is something that's applied by you during your production run, you need to make sure that that is happening correctly. So I have seen instances where people have used automated systems and have clicked the wrong button on a keyboard or on a screen and have used a former label, for instance, for a product, or they've used a label for the last product and the next product, or somebody looked at the file and said, no, that's not right, and has made an unauthorized change to the content of the file. So it's really important to have good controls on the information that goes into the system for printing if you're going to do in-house printing of your label information. And then finally, the most important one, make sure you match your products and packages. Put the right product in the right package. I can't tell you how many times we've seen that. That's one of the most important reasons for allergen-related recalls, and it has been every year for at least 5 or 6 and possibly as many as 10 years. It's I can't understand why it remains so common that products are put in the wrong package or some other mismanagement, the wrong label is put on. So if you're going to go to the trouble of making a good quality product and you're making the right product and you have designed and checked and double checked your packages and your labels, it's not that big a deal to make sure that the two of them get together properly. So it's a failure point that's common and it needs to be watched. The third pillar, control what you do. This is the one that people spend a lot of time and effort on, and it is important, but it is only as important as the other two pillars. So controlling what you do includes supplier controls. It includes cross-contact controls, and it includes facility cleaning. So let's look at these in a little bit. So is the information you have from your supplier up to date and accurate and complete? As I mentioned before, suppliers can and will change the formulations that they use, and you need to make sure that you have a system in place to encourage your suppliers, require your suppliers to let you know, but you also need to check to make sure that they have done that if they do it. And if you receive that information, please make sure you act on it. There was a case recently where somebody actually died from anaphylaxis because a retailer repackaged a cookie that they received from a supplier that had changed their recipe. The supplier notified the retailer, but the retailer didn't change their package, and it resulted in a tragedy. So please be careful with this one. Cross-contact control. It sounds complicated, but really what it means is separation, and it can be separation in time and or space. So by time, that can mean sequencing or controlling the order that you make your products. You want to try not to be making allergen products or non-allergen products directly after an allergen product, or to the extent that it's possible if you have different allergen contents in different products, to try and make the change between them one where you are increasing the number of allergens between the products so that there's a reduced chance of cross contact. Separation in space is important. This is one that includes issues such as storing products properly to reduce potential cross contact. But it can also mean using different processing lines. So if you have products with different allergen contents, you may be able, if you have multiple lines, to dedicate one line to making products with a certain allergen content and using other lines for products with other allergen content. This can also include things like putting up barriers to prevent splashes and dust from moving between the different lines. So separation is a really important control. And then finally, cleaning. And I'm very careful here with the idea that we're talking about cleaning, not sanitation. So allergen cleaning means removing protein residues. So that's what you need to aim for. Sanitation is a process which involves killing microbes. And it is possible to be sanitary in that regard, but not to have removed all of the protein residues. Certainly in sanitation, you're going to start by removing gross contaminants, but for really allergen clean, you need to go beyond that and remove all protein residues. So you need to think about it as a different and more intense kind of cleaning than you might normally use. And don't mistake treating with a sanitizer as in any way affecting proteins or allergenicity, or in the validation and verification of your cleaning. Don't confuse validation or verification that looks for organic residues from microbes as being the same as looking for the removal of proteins. Use cleaners that are designed for protein residues, designed for removing protein residues, and use verification activities that are designed to look for those residues. That also means being a lot more careful about how your cleaning works in hidden parts of your equipment, in transfer pipes, in places where you have inserts in the equipment like thermometers, to make sure there's no hangups in those areas of food or ingredients that could affect the next product down the line. And then there's the one which, having worked at FDA for a long time, everybody in the agency recognizes, and the industry should, the importance of documents and records. Now, in the past, sometimes I would talk about this and just say, you know, it's important, do it. But I really want to point out here a couple of interesting real world points, or at least one example. So the point is, you don't get any credit if you can't show your work. It reminds me of high school math class, that if you can't show that you did it, then you don't get credit for having done it. And this is one of the things that agency investigators will look for when they come in and do an inspection. They will look at your plans and they will look at what you have actually documented that you've done and see whether they match. But beyond that, I want to show you an example of a recall which occurred, I guess we're still in May, so I think it was earlier this month, for a company in Texas that is a maker of various kinds of nuts and nut mixes, that had to recall a large number of all of their products that were basically everything that they had put on the market for quite a while, because they had not declared properly the presence of their allergens. What happened to this company was that the Texas Department of Health came in and did an inspection at the facility and found a problem with the cleaning of their packaging machines. And because they couldn't prove that they had cleaned the machines correctly, they had to do this recall. In the recall, it says our packaging machine is cleaned properly. However, written documentation does not clearly state that. So this is a good warning, a heads up to everybody, that having documentation and being able to show that you have done things correctly is really important, because when it comes to hazards like allergens, that it's not assumed that you have done things. You have to display that. So show your work. Two other topics that I think are worth spending a few minutes on is, first one is advisory labels. So I mentioned we'd come back to talking about labels again in a little while, and this is where we're going to get to do that. So advisory labels. Advisory labels, just as a reminder, are the kinds of things that say may contain, or made in a facility that also makes, or made on equipment that also makes, or any one of a number of similar things. Make it clear that those advisory labels may contain are voluntary labels that are not regulated beyond FDA's statement that they should be truthful and not misleading. Okay, so there are no regulations yet on what an advisory label should say. And most difficult for the industry is there are no requirements, regulatory requirements or agency mandated guidance on when to use those labels. So there's a lot of confusion. They're used in ways that confuse consumers very much. And it makes it difficult for people to understand how seriously to take them. And that has a bad consequence because some consumers will not eat anything that has an advisory label on it just because they assume that that means there really is their allergen present. Other consumers ignore them altogether because they think that the industry is just simply using them as a method to try and avoid liability for their products. I will tell you that they don't have any regulatory impact. They don't have any legal impact. And in fact, in some senses, some of those may get you in more trouble depending upon the statements that you use if you have a recall or a labeling problem. The news that maybe is good is that there are some efforts underway to look at ways of putting some guidance in place as to when companies should use advisory labels. The FDA has recently issued a draft guidance on allergen control as part of the FSMA preventive controls guidance document. This is a chapter in that as of yet proposed guidance document, draft guidance, not finalized. And it suggests some steps that you can take to determine whether an advisory label is appropriate for your products. So the bottom line from those is it's basically a form of a risk assessment and involves knowing what levels of unintended allergens are present in your food, what consumer exposure is, and using some numbers of which there are non-official numbers at this point to determine whether the levels that consumers are exposed to represent a hazard to allergic consumers. So there's a lot of guidance or a lot of stuff in there that gives an overview of the process, but when you start to dig into the details, of course, it can get a little bit messy. But the thing that makes it really interesting is that the guidance makes it clear that if you are going to be using advisory labels, the agency is suggesting that your preventive controls qualified individual, or whoever is in charge of your food safety plan, should do a written assessment of why you think that those advisory labels are necessary and make that determination based on these general principles and put it as part of your file in your food safety plan. And that need also applies to your suppliers. So if you have a supplier that's giving you a product with an advisory label, always get the question about, should I pass that advisory on? Well, what you should be doing is finding out from your supplier why they have that advisory label on their products. They should be doing the same kind of statement. What in reality is going to be happening is if you can't get that information from your supplier, then you will need to go through the same kind of assessment I just talked about. You need to know what's present, how often it's present, how does it vary over time. You need to look at exposure through consumption of the products, and you need to do some form of risk assessment to determine whether it's a good idea to put the advisory labels on. It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out over the next few years, but it suggests that the agency is thinking about trying to find ways to deal with this issue. I'll also mention in here, although the advisory labels are about, may contain, there's also a clear thinking process about when you put a free from label on it. Does not contain free from or anything like that. If you find that your product does contain that material that you have free from on, the agency will expect the product to be recalled, and it will treat that as a class 1 recall, regardless of whether without that label it would have been a class 1 or not. With the label, the agency says you are tempting uh, sensitive consumers to eat your product, and that therefore raises the risk to consumers, and it will be a class 1 recall. The other topic I want to talk about a little bit here is testing and analysis. Many companies do some form of testing of their product to determine what the allergen status of their ingredients or their product is or are. I guess without going into a huge amount of detail here, there has been a lot of work done on developing various analytical systems. ELISA tests, swab tests, various kinds of uh, flow devices, lateral flow devices that can be used with various degrees of sensitivity and accuracy. The bottom line is any test that you are doing needs to be designed for using in the way that you're doing it. It needs to have been checked against its accuracy and sensitivity with the matrix that you're using it on in your system. And you need to think about whether your sampling procedures are giving you a statistically valid result. So, for instance, testing a supplier once a year uh, is not going to tell you a whole lot about how consistent that supplier is with what they do and whether there is undeclared allergens in their product. So you need to think about that. What I've advised people is that if you want to especially have enough information to support using or not using advisory labels, making sure that your systems are in control and so on, you may find that you want to do a pretty extensive amount of testing initially, and then to use the results of that testing to determine a less intense process, but one which will nevertheless give you the information that you need in order to ensure the safety of your products. So moving on from that, the other problem that is seen a lot and hear a lot of people talking about is the fact that implementing an allergen testing or an allergen control system is an investment that a company needs to make. You need to make a determination that it's worth doing. And the problem is, it's also you need to make a determination about whether or how to make it worth doing it well. So simply going through the motions a little bit versus actually doing a good job. So how do you convince others? And by others, it often means senior managers, the financial people, quality control, marketing. How can you convince them that allergen control is worth doing well? Well, I mentioned you can how expensive recalls are, but I really want to point out that having a good allergen control system is really very much the same or part of, even if it's unrecognized, what you already do in much of your quality control system. So that includes using vetted suppliers. Make sure your suppliers have their allergens in control. Use raw materials that meet predetermined specifications. So you can establish specifications for your ingredients that take into account the possibility of allergen cross contact. And you can make those part of your purchasing process. You can make sure that you manufacture according to your recipes. I mentioned that before under one of the pillars for allergen control. Same thing with quality control. If you want to make a quality product that's consistent from one lot or one batch to the next, you have to make sure that the people in the plant are following your recipes and procedures. Put your products in the right containers. Again, it doesn't do you, even if there is not an allergen problem and you don't need to make a recall, putting the wrong flavor or the wrong product in the wrong container is not good for your quality control and not good for consumer relations. And finally, the most important one, don't make a mess and then clean up afterwards. So that again is something which is part of quality or safety controls. And that's also something which is what basically you have to do for allergen control. Another thing that you can do to try and convince people that it's worth doing well is to recognize that every recall you're involved in is in your permanent record, as I call it. Again, reminds me of going back to high school. So this is an example of a timeline of all the recalls associated with one particular manufacturing facility. And I didn't, it only took me about 2 minutes to find this in particular one in the FDA's database. So the FDA has resources online that help you identify your suppliers and to see whether they're doing a good job. But that also means that if you're an FDA regulated facility, there's information about you in that. And one of the things that there is in there are all of the recalls that that facility has been associated with going back quite a few years. In this case, there were, what did I say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 recalls for this company over slightly less than a decade. So if you are trying to convince people that you are making a quality product and that you are under control for your safety system, oh, and I should say that these were allergen-related recalls in this case. People are going to look at your record or should look at your record and say, are they doing a good job of control? And if they see a pattern like this, they're likely to question that. So it's that information is available and it's online for anybody to use. So that's another reason why it's worth doing your allergen control well, is because others can see when the failures lead to a problem. So another piece of this is show what a recall would cost. I mentioned how expensive they are. Put the numbers down, make some valuations so that the business people get an idea of what's at stake. So you can use scenarios. This is what finance and marketing people call forecasting. They basically build scenarios that say, what's going to happen if? So you can look at a recall situation and say, suppose we had to do this recall. What would it cost us? How can we estimate the actual cost? And that goes back to what I was talking about in the very early part of this talk about all the different impacts a recall would have. And the fact is you have the basis for doing this because you are required under the FSMA regulation, the preventive controls rule, to test your recall plan periodically. So as you test the effectiveness of your recall plan, most companies will do this by setting up a scenario that says, suppose we had this particular problem and we have to do a recall. Could we do it? How quickly could we do it? Well, you can use that scenario as a basis for not only asking, can you contact all your the people downstream who need to be alerted to it? Can you figure out how to recover all the product? You can look at what it would cost to actually execute those different steps. And that will give you a basis for understanding how expensive a recall would be for you. And then you can try to build in some estimates of things like the hit it would take to your reputation, what other issues you would need to do, like extra cleaning or disposal or throwing out ingredients or finished products. And then finally, if I can get that, there we go. Learn from others' recalls. look at what others have had to go through, and use that as the basis for developing some of these scenarios. One of the really interesting things about recalls is, at least for class 1 recalls at FDA and for many recalls at USDA, there's information about the number of products that are actually involved in a recall. How much food needs to be recalled? Uh, Cases, pounds, gallons, number of SKUs, whatever. That really gives an interesting view on how extensive a allergen-related recall can be in some cases. So learn from others, especially if there are others who are having recalls that are your competitors or your industry or people who do things similar to yours. So having said that, I want to go back to where we started with this and say, you remember I talked about the 3 pillars of allergen recall prevention. That was knowing what you make, knowing what you say, and being in control of what you do. Control what you do. Well, one other thing I think I need to throw in here is there's actually a 4th pillar of recall prevention. And that pillar is to ask for help. That companies, manufacturers don't need to do this by themselves. There are people who can help you understand allergen control and make sure that your systems cover everything they're supposed to and really reduce the need or the potential that you're going to have recalls. So that's the 4th pillar. Ask for help when you need it. And with that, I will conclude my talk and just let you know that if part of the help is, of course, that I'm available to help you do this, and I'll be glad to answer specific questions here or to talk about your own individual issues offline or off the webinar. And with that, I think we can turn it back to the moderator.
That's right. All right, Steve, this was amazing. You covered a lot in just a short period of time, so I appreciate it. And the good news is, of course, again, we're recording this session, so everybody on this call will have a chance to go back and re-listen to some of the really, really great points that were brought up here. I'm seeing a ton of questions are starting to come in here. We did get a few that came in during the course of the presentation. So let's get started. I wanted to first focus on the topic of intended and unintended allergens. All right, so basically, if you know you are working with allergens, you have a plan to address that. Normal facilities will have that plan already built out. But when it comes to unintended allergens, and I know you mentioned having supplier controls, are there certain procedures that you can recommend in terms of getting ahead of potential unknown allergens? So we, again, talked about suppliers, we talked about cross-contamination. There are many different ways that, of course, an allergen can enter into the facility and enter into the product. So what simple steps should be taken that you've seen, Steve, in your experience, have somewhat been missed?
So you mentioned the 2 biggest ones is making sure that you know what your suppliers are supplying. And part of that is know enough about your suppliers to know what the potential is for cross contact at their facilities. Sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's not. So if you're, for instance, if you're getting, I don't know, let's take an example. If you're getting walnuts from a supplier who processes 4 other kinds of tree nuts, then you know that there's a potential for cross contact at their facility. And you need to go to that supplier and ask, what are you doing to control that risk? One, just like with food fraud, one of the issues with preventing unintended allergens, of course, is the form that you receive that ingredient. So for instance, if you receive um, whole nuts, it's relatively easy to examine them and look for things that don't look right. If you receive nut butter, it's a lot harder. So in that case, you need to think about the idea of doing some testing and some characterization. And it needs to be, as I mentioned before, a little bit more intense than what most people do on a routine basis until you have a comfort, reach a comfort level that you know what to expect, and then you can design a program that is less intense but equally informative. Um, in terms of cross contact, it's to make sure that people are aware of the issues on the production floor. Make sure that things like rapid changes in planned production don't lead to potential cross contact uh,
Mm,
from changeover and so on. Another important one, as I mentioned, is cleaning. Again, in when you're talking about sanitizing, you can flood a system with a sanitizing chemical and be pretty sure that you've got taken care of the problem. But you can't do that for removing allergen residues. Are there places in the system where there are potential hangups? Make sure that if there are, that you are checking those when you clean, not just the places that are easiest to get to, and do different ones, different places at different times. This is an issue that needs to be looked at on a facility by facility basis, and of course, as everyone knows, the risk also varies depending upon how old your facility and your equipment are. Things which are built more recently or renovated more recently and using more modern equipment might be easier to deal with than older equipment in older facilities.
mm. Marcia was asking if you recommend always having a verification step, such as when you're swabbing, to make sure that you have that at least checked off that you've done it, and that also can be verified later should an investigation happen.
Yes.
Yep. All right.
Okay. That's very simple. Yes. You need a monitoring record to show
Hmm.
that it was done, and the verification is basically the double check to make sure that it was done and that it followed the rules. Um, so I would say yes.
Well, let's continue that thread. So you were talking about always showing your work, and obviously documentation is the main way to do that. Are there any recommendations for the types of documents that you should have? I know you did talk about a couple, but for example, voluntary advisory labels, right? It's not necessarily required. You even said that it might actually get you in trouble. What are some of the things that these folks here can start building a checklist for when it comes to making sure that you've covered all of the bases when it comes to allergen controls?
Uh, that's a good one because it is going to vary depending again about the products and the ingredients that you
Mm,
use. Um, I I guess I would say that anytime you make a decision about yes, we should do this or no, we shouldn't, that decision should be justified in I guess I shouldn't say in writing anymore. It should be justified in PDFing or in
some
electrons
type of
someplace.
digital record, yeah.
Yeah, there should be some record of the fact that you considered this issue and you made this decision for this reason. So, in the examples that FDA and FSPCA have of how to do a preventive controls hazard analysis,
Right,
it's, what each step or each ingredient along the way, it asks, is there a potential for a hazard? And it has different kinds of hazards. And then it asks, how do you justify your decision? So
right.
I think that's how you do it.
Hmm.
Is by making sure that you have backing for your decision. If your decision is based on information from a certain place or site or even historical records, make sure that you can actually show that that's the case. I have seen some that will say, um, we haven't seen this kind of problem in the past. And I ask, well, how do you know you haven't
How
seen
do
it?
you know?
How can you
Yeah.
show you haven't seen it? So that really is what it gets down to. Is it, especially now in this information age, having access to that information is important.
Yeah, and again, we're talking about having a historical record, whether it be from your suppliers. Have they consistently been up to date in sending information, or have you consistently been following the processes to avoid cross contact,
Yep.
contamination, things like that? Yeah.
Right.
One thing you brought up about hazard controls. I got a question here from Admit who says Faster Act, FASTER Act, calls for treatment and remediation of affected allergic patients. Will the future, this is obviously your opinion, will the future require HACCP plans with treatment and remediation control options?
So the FASTER Act required that um, I don't know whether it's the NIH or the FDA work on developing those. It did not require that as part of a food safety plan.
Hmm.
What the only thing the FASTER Act required in terms of what we're talking about today is the addition of sesame as one of the major food allergens. Those other things are not part of FDA's enforcement requirement. So no, you do not need to consider treatment plans for consumers, but you do need to consider if you're doing a risk assessment based approach, you need to have some idea of sensitivity of consumers to the allergens.
Mm, Sorry, I'm just reading a response from Marcia here. She says, any recommendations on ATP versus a generic allergen swab or true protein specific swab? So that was in response to her
Yeah.
question around a verification step. Yeah.
So I will say this, one of the ones where I can be pretty clear about. I don't believe that ATP swabs are useful for measuring allergen cleaning.
Hmm.
Um, I have seen companies who sell them who claim they are, but I have never seen any data which shows that that's the case. So if you're dealing with a company that says you can use our ATP swabs to tell you about allergen cleaning, then what you got to say is show me the data, which I suppose ought to be the mantra for all of this stuff is show me the data. On the other hand, using a general protein swab is, I think, a useful approach, especially if you're dealing with multiple allergens. It's a reasonable approach if you use it after you've shown that it works to do what you expect it to do. If you have an allergen, if your allergen of concern, if there are specific allergen swabs for your allergen of concern, that certainly is worth considering using them maybe as a cross check to your general protein swabs. So I guess in terms of what I would think is the scientific validity of them is and utility would be the specific swabs, the general protein swabs, and then way down the list is ATP swabs.
Okay. I'm going to get one more question in before we need to sign out here, but going back to cross-contact controls, I know you had mentioned you can sequence processes or use dedicated lines. Would you also recommend using dedicated equipment?
I guess that's sort of, I would consider that as being equivalent to a dedicated line. Um,
Okay. And would you
uh,
suggest maybe even having a separate like room set up for allergen related processes?
if you have the ability to do that, the more separation, the better. A lot of facilities are not set up to allow that. So putting up some sort of barriers in between, you can even use removable barriers like plastic film
Hmm.
if you can't do that. Certainly, if you have the ability to do it, you should.
Okay. That question came from Priya. So Priya, I hope you heard that. Okay, looks like we're running out of time, Steve, but again, I'm going to flash up your contact information for anybody that wants to get in touch with Steve to learn a little bit more about his recommendations around allergen controls. Obviously, there's a lot more to discuss here. Steve, I really appreciate your time today, and obviously, I want to have you come back on because this topic is not going away. We can always learn how to improve on making sure that allergen-related recalls do not happen, as we saw that one example with that company that you shared. If you have any questions around other food safety related items, you can of course head on over to the Acheson group at achesongroup.com or Safety Chain. We have a ton of learning items, whether they're e-guides or recordings such as this FSMA Friday. We have it all. So please do check those resources out. I want to thank everybody. And of course, Steve, amazing presentation today. We hope you have a great weekend ahead, and we hope to see you on the next FSMA Friday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening.
Take care.